Good evening, everyone. My name is Phyllis Tierman. For those of you who don't know me, I am one of the leadership team members from Sustainable Wellesley, and we're very grateful that you're here. Other people on the Sustainable Wellesley leadership team are Evelyn, Quentin, Scott, Nikki, Trish, and Mary Gard. We're thankful for all their work on this event. For those that don't know, Sustainable Wellesley, we're an all-volunteer organization. We're a nonprofit, and we engage residents, businesses in the town of Wellesley to take sustainable actions to protect our climate, reduce pollution of air, land, and water, preserve biodiversity, minimize waste, and ensure environmental justice. I'd also like to thank our co-host is the Wellesley Health Department. So thank you very much. And are the co-sponsors, and I'm going to introduce Joyce Surrett from the Wellesley Health Department. She's the senior community social worker, and I'll let her say a quick hello.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. My name is Joyce Surrett. I'm a social worker from the Health Department in Wellesley, as Phyllis just told you. And the Health Department is very pleased to collaborate with Sustainable Wellesley this evening as we discuss this important topic of how climate change impacts our mental health. For those of you who don't know, please know that we are available at the Health Department to provide support and resources to our residents around what issues you might ask, including things like referrals for counseling, financial assistance, housing issues, food insecurity, just to name a few. We know that this is a time of high anxiety for everyone for so many different reasons, and no one has to struggle in isolation. That's the main theme. So I'm delighted to hear what is going to be presented this evening, because it promises to be an informative and engaging webinar. And please feel free to contact me at the Health Department. I'm looking forward to the presentation, and I think my information on how I can be contacted is going to be up there at some point. So please feel free to give me a call or send me an email if you would like. Back to Phyllis.
Thank you. So I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping. Most people, we are all on mute, and I'm just going to remind everyone that this is being recorded, but towards the end, we will have a Q&A portion, and we were going to turn off the recording so people feel more comfortable asking questions. We have at the Q&A is going to be at the end, so we request hopefully that you'll keep some of your questions until the end or put them in the chat, and then we'll try to get to them at the end. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why we started this. We decided to do this event. So I've been at a couple different events with students, and they've been talking about things that were pretty deep and around climate. And I don't know if Will Kramer is here this evening, but I was going to give him an opportunity to speak up. If you're on, Will, you can unmute yourself. I don't see him. So in the meantime, I'm just going to share an email that I got from a local student. She's a Wellesley College student. And sorry, I'm just checking one thing. Oh, Will is here. He can't come off mute though. Oh, can we help him get off mute, please, Evelyn? It says William Kramer.
Hello, there you go. Can you hear me?
Thank you, Will. Thank you.
Yeah,
okay.
Of course.
Please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit of your journey, if you don't mind.
Of course, sure. So my name is Will. I am currently a high school teacher in Revere. I teach ESL, so that's English as a second language. And when I was in high school, I wanted to come on and say a few words because I've had a lot of climate anxiety in my life. And my mom is in the Sustainable Wellesley, so that she let me know about this. But when I was in high school, had a lot of issues kind of thinking about, at that time already, with the Paris Climate Accord was just starting and it hadn't been signed, and and so I was kind of distressed about what all these kind of global scale, climate change is such an overwhelming global thing. So was really getting to me, but it kind of gave me a on-ramp into getting more involved in activism. And so working on the 2016 campaign, and then the midterms, I went to school in Ohio. So working on midterms there and the 2020 election. So kind of through working on, at least me personally, that's been one of the main ways I've been able to cope with my climate anxiety, is just getting involved in phone banking and government related things. And everybody has their own path, you know, it doesn't have to necessarily be through electoral politics, but I know just from a personal perspective, doing some of that work and activism work has kind of let me, has helped me deal, because I know that I'm doing something. I'm not just, I'm not being passive. So it keeps me, kept me active. And, you know, so over the years, that's kind of been my method of dealing with the climate anxiety.
Thank you, Will. Thank you
Mhm.
for your
Yeah,
time and your honesty. We really appreciate it.
of course.
So Will is not alone. As I said, I was going to read an excerpt from a Wellesley College student, but I think Will really summed up probably why many of us are here tonight. But I'm super grateful because I got introduced to Dr. Kelsey Hudson. Dr. Hudson is a child adolescent clinical psychologist at the Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders at Boston University. Here, she provides psychotherapy to youth with anxiety, depression, and social emotional difficulties, and conducts research on the psychological effects of climate change on youth. She is a member of the Climate Psychology Alliance North America and leads the youth subcommittee through the CPNA, that's the Climate Psychology Alliance North America. In 2021, Dr. Hudson received a certificate in climate change and health from the Yale School of Public Health and opened up a private practice specializing in treating climate distress. She is also co-editing a book on climate change and young people's mental health that will be published by the Cambridge University Press. So I will leave it to you, Dr. Hudson. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I look forward to this discussion.
Thank you so much, Phyllis, and thank you, William and Joyce, for your contributions too. Really appreciate it. I'm so thrilled to be here. And tonight, just to give you a little overview of what we'll cover, we will talk about the mental health impacts of climate change on young people and go over some ideas, just ideas, there's no right way, but ideas for coping effectively and moving towards an empowered stance rather than a stuck stance. At the end, we'll offer some resources at state levels and local levels, as well as national levels. And then, like Phyllis said, we'll leave some time for Q&A at the end. We will also have some polls because we are feeling fancy. So we'll have some polls throughout. But if you would be kind enough to leave questions to the end, that would be really helpful. So our first poll question, just to get a sense of our audience, is what age bracket are you in? The reason we want to know is that climate change, we're starting to understand that the mental health effects of climate change are impacting people in different ways depending on their age. So we just wanted to get a bit of a sense of our audience tonight. Perfect. I think we're 100%. Thank you, everyone. Evelyn, do you mind sharing the results if possible? Oh, perfect. Can everyone see that okay? All right, so it looks like we have an amazing spread. I'm really impressed. So yeah, some of the stuff we'll talk about today will be focused on young people, which is pretty broadly defined. And most of the things we'll talk about relate to all ages. But if people have specific questions about that at the end, happy to try to answer them. Thank you so much, Evelyn. All right. So Phyllis, do you think we're good to move to the next slide? I can't see what the numbers are on my end.
Yes, go for it.
Perfect. So there's a lot of different ways of thinking about how climate change impacts our mental health. And there's many different frameworks that we could use to talk about this, but this framework I think is really helpful to think about direct effects of climate change on mental health. For example, developing post-traumatic stress from a natural disaster or an extreme weather event. There's also indirect effects, which could look like distress from forced migration or climate refugees, and also things called eco-social effects. So that would be things like economic losses or housing instability or increased poverty, or even things like educational interruptions that are climate related, but not necessarily direct. And of course, we know that climate change is impacting physical health in terms of air quality and heat, for example. A couple of examples of this might be poor air quality contributing to greater rates of asthma, and people with asthma have higher risk of mental health challenges. So that's a health comorbidity that relates to climate change and mental health. We're also seeing an increase in vector-borne diseases in different areas. In our area, obviously, we're looking at something more like Lyme, but also globally, there are higher rates of dengue fever. And of course, those can have nutritional and physical development and mental health impacts as well. So before we get into more on the feelings end of things, we wanted to ask people how climate change has made them feel. So we're going to have another poll. We have a couple of different emotions here, but if you don't see one, that's really understandable. And you can write it in the chat if you like. Yeah, these answers make a lot of sense. A lot of anxiety, a lot of loss and sadness. Some people not feeling stressed, which is also natural. A lot of anger and hopelessness. Actually, these almost perfectly reflect a lot of other data nationally and globally. So that this makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you for sharing your feelings. And I'll go a little bit more into climate emotions now. So we'll talk more about this, but there's a lot of terms coming into our awareness that try to capture the complex psychological responses that climate change brings up. This word cloud is not just feelings that are anecdotal, but is a word cloud that somebody recently, it's a word cloud from a climate emotion taxonomy that somebody recently made. And so all of these feelings are feelings that young people and people of all ages across the globe feel in response to climate change. So as I'm talking about this, I'd really like you to take a look at the wide variety of emotions that people feel. Because we are biologically inclined to focus on negative emotions, we're often hearing about climate anxiety and ecological grief. Those are certainly really important, but it's also very natural to feel indifferent or even disinterested or neutral, or feel positive or welcome feelings like motivated or joyful or hopeful. And there may be feelings here that are not expressed and that you've noticed in yourself. So the main point here is that climate emotions are extremely complex, and we might stay with one, we might have multiple emotions at once, we might vary throughout our experience of learning about climate change and then taking action. So it's very nebulous and very fluid. I wanted to provide this quote because we're naturally very inclined to try to shut out negative feelings or challenging feelings like anxiety or grief or even anger. But the flip side of grief is love. And the reason a lot of this is so painful is because, as Steve Hayes, who's a very cool psychologist, says, we hurt where we care. So our emotions are telling us something about how we're showing up. If we feel sad, that's a reasonable emotion to feel, to signal that we are having a loss reaction. If we feel angry, that might mean we feel like something important is being threatened. If we feel anxious, we're concerned about the future. So our emotions are actually these very important and pretty helpful biological clues that can inform how we're showing up, what we care about. And even though feeling the pain can be uncomfortable, it's because it's generally thought to be a very empathic response to this crisis. This is Walden Pond, by the way. You might have seen a lot of different terms come up recently in the past several years, especially with the rise in youth activism. There's been a lot of terms coming up. So I just wanted to orient people to some of the things that they might see. Just having an awareness of climate change. We're not even talking about all the reactions that come from the trauma response after a disaster or something like that, but just having awareness of climate change can be described in some of these terms. So for example, the anxiety trauma response, people have talked about this in terms of climate anxiety or pre-traumatic stress or existential dread. In the grief loss area, there are terms like ecological grief. Some people experience identity problems or identity confusion. For example, farmers and indigenous peoples whose livelihoods and identities are very closely tied to the land. This is a common reaction. There's a term called solastalgia, which is pretty beautiful. That means the emotional or existential distress caused by environmental change. And then there's a group of terms that describe the anger response, moral outrage, moral injury. Those really get at the moral and ethical qualities of climate change and the inequalities in who will be most impacted by climate change, as well as righteous anger, which is one of my personal favorites. So now I'm gonna just pause quickly on all of the emotions that we just talked about. They're and in our poll. There was a lot of anxiety, a lot of sadness. Those emotions are not pathological. They're not a mental health disorder. There's everything about those emotions is extremely reasonable, understandable, if not expected about climate change. So people in the climate psychology world are really not thinking about climate distress as anything except a very natural, very empathic response to a very real crisis. But if it does start to get in the way for people's functioning in the same way that any other type of anxiety or sadness or grief might get in the way, then that might be a time when people could use extra support or extra social or therapeutic support. So now I'm going to talk about young people, because there are some trends in differences in feelings for young people and a different stance for young people. So there's this very cool study happened recently that was the first study to really look globally at how young people are thinking and feeling about climate change. And this comes from a group of 10,000 kids from a number of different countries from the global north and south, and they were ages 16 to 25. That was such a mouthful, sorry. But we're talking about teenagers to emerging adults, at least from how we see that from an American lens. Almost 60% of these young people globally felt extremely or very worried about climate change, and only 5% felt not at all worried. 60% about felt sad, afraid, or anxious. And then looking specifically in the US, this is a couple years old, so it may have shifted, but about 60% of teenagers in the US a couple years ago reported feeling afraid, and around 50% felt angry. There's also a big number of teenagers feeling guilty and helpless. Those are really powerful feelings that can be difficult to tolerate. So zooming out, these are not kids who are coming into a clinic. These are not people seeking therapeutic support. These are individuals who are just going about their everyday lives, and these are the rates of distressing emotions that we're seeing. From that same global study, we also learned for the first time that climate distress was linked with the perception that governments are not responding adequately. And that is huge, because it wasn't a causal relationship, but there is a relationship between inaction on a systems level and a global level and by the fossil fuel industry and greater climate distress. Young people felt more distressed if they also had perceptions of being betrayed by their governments or other adults, and being abandoned by their governmental bodies or other adults. One thing that comes up anecdotally a lot is the response that many people get when they try to talk with other people about climate change. There's even an app about this called Cranky Uncle that's designed to help people talk to climate deniers or people who are cranky about climate change. But that's a total aside. This slide is about how a large number of young people feel like their concerns have been dismissed or ignored when they have tried to talk with people about climate change or about their feelings. So we wanted to hear from you in real time when you have discussed your feelings about climate change with other people. How have you felt? And we have a couple options up here. And as always, feel free to write in the chat if other reactions have come up that aren't adequately listed here. it's important to recognize that these answers may also reflect our political and geographical space, but that I'm expecting there's going to be a range of answers. All right. Oh, this is very thrilling. I'm so glad that 70% of people felt like it was productive. We chose the word productive instead of good because that could mean really anything, but we wanted to really highlight that productive conversations can happen even when disagreements are there. It is also unsurprising that a large number of people have felt ignored or dismissed or invalidated, and that some people haven't discussed this with anyone for whatever reason. So thank you for sharing that. Turning to thoughts about climate change, these are some thoughts from that same global study of 10,000 young people ages 16 to 25. This is not comprehensive, but here are some numbers that I just want to show you all because they're pretty striking. So again, globally, all sorts of different countries, all sorts of climate exposure, natural disaster exposure. 84% of the 10,000 young people said that they had thoughts about people failing our planet. 77% said that the future was frightening. 58% that humanity is doomed. Many people are thinking about how things they really care about or really value will be changed, if not totally gone or destroyed. And then this is a pretty important conversation that a lot of people are having, but about 4 in 10 of these young people globally reported some hesitance to have children. That does not mean they're not going to. But this is a really, really huge decision that climate change is impacting for a lot of young people. I also want to highlight, I know that these thoughts are skewed towards the negative. In this study, there were not thoughts about optimism or hope, but those certainly do occur for people, especially as they move into action. Whenever we talk about the effects of climate change on health or mental health, it's really important to touch on the fact that climate change is an inequality multiplier. It will exacerbate existing inequalities and make them worse. So a lot of people feel like we have to address systemic racism first or climate change first, but really they're extremely intertwined because the burdens and consequences from climate change will fall most heavily on people and communities who have historically and currently been and are currently being oppressed by social and political and economic power dynamics. So that's also something that a lot of young people are pretty concerned about. Many of you might have heard of the 6 Americas ongoing study from Yale, but this is a really cool ongoing data collection that's happening that is luckily showing us that groups of Americans that they have identified as the 6 Americas, ranging from dismissive of climate change to alarmed. We are now seeing more and more people over the years shifting to the left-hand side of this graph, to the concerned and alarmed categories. So this is pretty awesome because even if people are feeling a lot of concern and alarm or anxiety, those types of feelings can be really helpful for harnessing into action and kind of represent a growing awareness that there is a real threat that needs to be addressed. I also think this is a helpful figure because people who are actually dismissive or doubtful are in the minority in America, and it doesn't always feel like that. The Yale program also has a cool interactive map that allows us to see at the county level in each state the percentage of adults who are reporting the different drop downs from their study. So for Mass, as of last year, 71% of adults who responded to this in Mass think global warming will harm future generations. But this is a really cool tool that we can use if we're trying to take action at a local level, trying to get stats on how people in our state feel and think. So I would encourage people to go check that out. But also just zooming out, people in Massachusetts are very concerned about how climate change is impacting the future. So all of that may be quite overwhelming. And now we're going to shift into the coping and empowerment segment of tonight. And these recommendations are coming from the climate psychology field in general, my own clinical experiences with young people and adults, and also this huge report that the American Psychological Association put out last year that basically said climate change is a serious threat to our mental health, and here are some recommendations for supporting people through their climate emotions. So we'll touch on each of these things, and I will suggest, not recommend, but just suggest examples of things that people can do for each of these areas: acknowledging your experience, building belief in yourself, fostering optimism and hope, coping strategies that are helpful for something that's chronic and unrelenting like climate change, clarifying our purpose and meaning, boosting supports, and connecting to place. Because I'm a psychologist, I had to throw in some relaxation techniques. But I also think it's unfair to talk about coping without actually suggesting some things that people can do to regulate their stress. So if you will bear with me, I wanted to show you one relaxation strategy and one mindfulness strategy that I hope you can take with you if you are already overwhelmed from all those numbers, or just as you start to think about how you want to show up to this crisis and how you need to regulate and manage all of the feelings that come with this. So the first thing I want to share is diaphragmatic breathing. And for kids, this can be called belly breathing or balloon breathing. Many of you probably already know about this or do it anyway, but the concept here is to inhale deeply through your nose, and your belly should blow up like a balloon. And exhale out through your mouth, and your belly should squeeze in towards your spine. Just to get slightly nerdy for a second, this is not only just relaxing, but this tool actually activates something called the parasympathetic nervous system, which is tenderly labeled the rest and digest response. That is our body's natural response to coming down from the fight, flight, freeze response. So it helps us kick in our digestion, lower our heart rate. And so by doing diaphragmatic breathing, it is totally relaxing for a lot of people, but you're actually helping your body retrain how to calm down when you're in fight, flight, or freeze. The next strategy is called drop and anchor. And this is related to getting back into your body when you're experiencing an emotional storm. That could be any emotion that just feels overwhelming, or any news that feels overwhelming, pretty much anything that feels overwhelming. We can do this anywhere by starting to feel our feet on the floor, starting to notice how our body is situated in our chair or our couch, or if you're lying down. Or you can integrate this with diaphragmatic breathing and use your 5 senses to focus on your breath, what it feels like, what it sounds like, etc. This is a nice thing to do also if you need kind of a quick way to come back to your body when you're extremely distressed. Okay, so moving into coping and empowerment. Our first, sorry, I skipped one. Our first thing we want to do is really take stock of how we're feeling. I know this sounds really therapist-y, but without actually noticing and acknowledging how we feel, we will not do well trying to take sustainable action, because we'll burn out really quickly and we won't be able to manage our emotions. So learning to observe our thoughts and emotions and body sensations, like we talked about with the emotion cloud, can actually help us understand how we're feeling and think about how we want to move forward. We can do this by acknowledging what thoughts are happening in our minds and what feelings we're having, whether that's emotions or body feelings. Coming back to our body by using something like the diaphragmatic breathing or dropping an anchor. And then engaging in what you're doing and asking yourself, what matters to me here? Is being on Instagram or reading the news excessively to learn about climate change or other global crises, is that bringing me towards who I want to be right now? Maybe it is. And a lot of the time we are doing things like avoidance or kind of numbing out, and it might be more helpful to do something more effective as a coping strategy. In terms of building up our belief in ourselves, not only is this good for confidence, but if we have stronger beliefs about our own ability to overcome stress, that can help us cope and lead to more effective coping, like engaged coping versus avoidance. Some ways that we can build up our belief in our own abilities and our own sense of agency here in the climate crisis are to take small steps, like talking about climate change with someone. I would also argue that's not really a small step. That can be really hard. Or to do something a little bit bigger, like join an organization or go to a protest or talk about climate change with your teacher or in your faith community. It can also be useful when we're feeling pretty down about climate change or completely overwhelmed about the scope of the problem to reflect on different times we've moved through challenging situations and remind ourselves that we are capable, even if we're applying that strength to a different situation or a different setting like climate change. Before we go on, I wanted to pause on the power of role models, because this is, I think, one of the most important takeaways here. A lot of research suggests that observing other people who are taking meaningful actions to address climate change enhances belief in one's own abilities. So if you think about you or your family taking climate action, not only is that helpful for building up your own sense of your ability to manage in this crisis and to help with collective action, but you're also serving as a powerful role model for others who will then likely think, oh, that person did that, I can do it too. This is based on so much research, and it's really powerful, especially when we think about peer messengers or talking with people about climate change. Those are huge interventions. They are not small. It's almost impossible to get through a crisis, especially one as unrelenting and chronic as climate change, without optimism and hope. And that might make some of you bristle because, as we saw, it's easy to feel hopeless and very natural to feel hopeless. And sometimes it's pretty hard, if not impossible, to feel optimistic about where things are going. But hope and optimism actually help us during hard times because they allow us to kind of cultivate positive emotions. And feeling positive emotions helps us recover from trauma and disaster and cope more effectively. So this isn't just the opposite of feeling sad. It's really or hopeless. It's the presence of positive feelings versus the absence of challenging ones. And it takes practice. So you might cultivate hope or positivity by doing something like a gratitude exercise with your family, or going out and doing enjoyable events or activities, even if they're not climate related. If you're looking for some climate related optimism, I highly recommend the Climate Optimism newsletter, which comes out of the Harvard School of Public Health. In terms of, sorry, my slides are going a little crazy. In terms of coping styles, this really means our conscious effort to regulate emotions and thoughts, regulate our behavior and our bodies, and try to regulate our environment in response to stressful events. This is a challenging task to take active coping in the face of stress. So you might try practicing effective coping skills like some of the relaxation or mindfulness strategies we talked about, showing yourself or others more compassion, taking a break, seeking more support, and trying to move away from coping strategies that are more avoidant or kind of numb our emotions. Or even, in contrast, over engagement with news or difficult material. And again, this takes active practice. While we're doing all of that, clarifying your sense of purpose in this crisis is a good way to start to build meaning and increase your belief in yourself. So this looks so different for everyone, but could mean doing activities that bring you closer to protecting what matters to you. For example, some people really care about children's health in areas like urban heat islands, or animals and species lost, or protecting forests, or your town and its infrastructure. It doesn't even have to be a natural setting. A lot of people feel like they aren't enough or they can't make a difference. And that is just wildly not true, because everybody has what it takes to apply their own skill sets and engage meaningfully. So if we think about where we live, where we work, and where we play, there's usually at least one opportunity for a little bit more engagement in one of those areas. And that can make you feel like you have a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning throughout all of this. Our social supports are truly essential as we go through the task of managing our feelings, learning more about climate change, and dealing with the climate crisis. So getting adequate social support is a superpower in terms of protecting yourself. This might look like sharing your experience with a trusted person, or joining other people who are engaged in meaningful action. It could also be not climate related at all and just talking more with friends about non-climate related things, or boosting your social supports in other ways, like through sports or clubs or online communities. In terms of our connection with our place, there's a lot of research to suggest that when we have shared care for a community, people draw together for action more. And that means that communities become more resilient because people are more willing to take adaptive actions or mitigation actions. So building up your connection to your place does not have to be going out into nature in a really intense way. It can be anything that allows you to kind of cultivate or connection or connect to your surroundings. If you do feel like it's helpful to be in natural settings, that's also a huge mood booster. So it can be nice to spend time in yards or community gardens, or parks, or go hiking, but that does not have to happen to connect to place. So Phyllis, I'm going to hand it off to you because you have compiled this amazing list of meaningful action ideas. And thank you for doing that. I'd love to hear more.
So I think for many of us, and I know many people on here, doing something gives you some sort of satisfaction. You feel like, okay, I can get through this because I'm taking action. So we pulled up just a couple local statewide things like the Mass Climate Action Network. I would recommend checking them out. First, I guess I would say I would go check out all of these options and see which one, if any, ring true to you. You'll probably find some new friends along the way. I know I have. There's Mothers Out Front, which we don't have here in Wellesley, but if you're not in Wellesley, they're in other parts of the state. The Sunrise Movement is a national movement, maybe even international, and they're definitely on many university campuses. The Sierra Club has obviously a national, international, but there is Sierra Club Massachusetts, so you can do things really hyper local. And then Extinction Rebellion is also out of England, and they are, I would lean them towards the rebellion part a little bit more. So if that's your speed, check them out. They're called XR. Locally, if you go to one of the high schools around or the colleges, there's plenty of clubs. I know there's some at Babson, there's many at Wellesley College, the high school. I know we have some of the high school Climate Action Club members here. And at the House of Worship, if you go to a House of Worship, there's many green teams definitely here in Wellesley and beyond. Of course, you're always welcome here at Sustainable Wellesley. We are all volunteer. And like I said, I've made some beautiful friendships through this organization. And if you're not really sure what you want to do, there's Fridays for Future, which is out of our friends, obviously, in Seattle and Stockholm. Greta, she started this movement a few years ago. And we've been doing it here in Wellesley for the last 2 years. We just stand out in front of town hall. You walk up. There's one gentleman who might even be on this call who's made signs. You can just grab a sign that's meaningful to you. And we just stand there for 1 hour while the Friday afternoon traffic comes by. And it's actually a little meditative because you can't really be on your phone because you're holding your sign and you get lots of beeps. Sometimes you get a like flipped off, but most of the time it's positive feedback. And you're with like-minded people. And we've met just some great people of all ages. So I highly recommend that. And I'm sure there's plenty in other communities too, not just here in Wellesley. And also another one, if you are an adult here in Wellesley, we have Wellesley Green Schools too, which I highly recommend you check out. I forgot to put them on the list, but thank you for the reminder, Michelle. And I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much for this. I also wanted to offer some more climate psychology related resources and some parenting resources. So the Climate Psychology Alliance of North America has a climate aware therapist directory, and people are still joining. It's relatively new, but it is exciting to see more therapists becoming trained in climate emotions, and providing climate aware care. Through that organization, there's also groups called climate cafes. They're not therapeutic groups, so anyone can join. They range from free to a small donation. And those are groups led by trained facilitators where individuals can join to express their feelings and reactions to climate change and hear from others as well in confidential spaces. There's a really amazing blog called Gen Dread regarding all sorts of angles related to climate change and mental health. There are some eco-sensitive meditations on Insight Timer that you can check out, as well as some podcasts that really focus on the cultivation of positive or welcome emotions called Climate Change and Happiness. And then for people who are interested in talking more about climate change or talking with young people about climate change, I highly recommend talkclimate.org as a way to get really comprehensive resources and handouts in educational settings, in different family settings, and for a wide variety of ages for kids and teens and young people. There are also a couple of books that I put up here. All the Feelings Under the Sun is written by a climate mental health provider, Leslie Davenport. This is for young people to navigate their feelings about climate change. So there's a lot of exercises and a lot of action items. There are a couple of books about parenting in a changing climate, and how to talk to your kids about climate change. I would highly recommend those books. And then for Gen Z specifically, there's a book called A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety by Sarah Jaquette Ray. And that is for a kind of specific group of young people, but it's a really helpful book as well. Just because this is being recorded, I put all of these here in case people want to look up the climate and psychology references that are listed. And that wraps up our presentation portion. Thank you so much for listening and for contributing. And we will shift into the, I think the Q&A portion now.
Yes, thank you.